300 tons. That is the weight resting on a single man's shoulders in the pitch-black Canadian winter. You stand on an ice road in the northern bush. The temperature hasn't cracked zero in 3 weeks, and the forest is so dense you can't see 10 feet in any direction. Before you sits the Lombard Steam Log Hauler, 30 feet of iron, steel, and superheated water under pressure. It doesn't just haul logs, it devours the forest and drags it to market. On a single run, this 19-ton beast replaces 60 horses, doing in one season what used to take 100 men and 1,000 animals a decade to finish. But here is the mechanical paradox that should keep you awake. 300 tons of timber is moving behind you on 8 chained sleds, and there are no brakes. No brakes on the machine, no brakes on the sleds. Nothing between you and the tree line but your own hands on a frozen iron wheel and whatever nerve God gave you that morning. If the momentum overtakes the engine on a downgrade, you are no longer an engineer. You are a passenger on a 320-ton runaway train. We are going to explore how this machine revolutionized an industry and armed a generation of soldiers. But first, if you find these deep dives into our gritty industrial history valuable, support the channel by subscribing and liking. Thank you. Now, back to the lethal reality of the Great White North. Think your modern diesel truck is tough? Try keeping a 3,000-ton steam dredge alive in a 40-degree Yukon winter. Precision engineering in 1905 didn't mean sensors and hydraulics. It meant hitting a frozen gear with a sledgehammer until it sang. It meant sitting in the open air with a smokestack directly above your head, where the sparks landed on your wool coat so often that catching fire was simply considered part of the job description. Now, let's descend into the gears and grease of the machines that built the Great White North. You feel the vibration of the twin vertical cylinders through the soles of your boots. The logging industry is the engine driving the growth of every North American city, and every railroad tie or house frame starts here, in the cold. The problem is simple and brutal. How do you move a 5-ton log through 4 feet of snow to a mill 30 miles away? Before Alvin Lombard, the answer was horses. They slipped, they broke legs on frozen ruts, and they had to be shot where they fell. In a bad winter, a company could lose 20 horses. In a catastrophic one, they lost the entire profit margin. But the men driving those horses weren't safe either. A runaway sled or a snapping harness pole moved faster than a man could run. When a worker was crushed, the company buried him in the spring when the ground finally thawed and simply found someone else to hold the reins. This is the world Alvin Lombard watched from his machine shop in Waterville. He understood wood the way men do when they grow up inside the sound of a saw by feel, by the particular vibration of something running right versus something about to fail. He carried that intuition into iron and steam. When a lumberman asked him for a machine that wouldn't die or tire, Lombard returned with drawings in 24 hours. He already had the answer. He built a model, then a machine he called Mary Ann. On Thanksgiving Day 1900, he lit the fire under her boiler. At first, she just shook like a confused animal, her tracks spinning in place. Lombard didn't quit. He adjusted the geometry, added steel cleats to the tracks so they bit into the ice like a horseshoe, and patented the first successful continuous track ever applied to a commercial vehicle. You look at the tracks now, the direct mechanical ancestor of the tank and the bulldozer. In 1904, when Lombard demonstrated the machine pulling 40,000 board feet of logs, ministers shut down their churches so congregations could watch. Lumbermen wrote checks for $5,000 on the spot, but those crowds only saw the machine in its finest moment. They didn't see the 2 a.m. runs. They didn't see the steersman's coat smoldering. They didn't see what happens when the grade drops and the 300 tons behind you decides it wants to go faster than the 19 tons in front. The chain of operation is relentless. Fire heats water. Water becomes steam. Steam drives pistons. Pistons turn gears. Gears drive sprockets. Sprockets move tracks. Every rotation moves the cleated steel links that grip the ice. Break any link in that chain on a downgrade, and the stay-with-her men are the only ones left to decide if they jump or ride the wreck into the timber. Section 2. The birth of the Lombard crawler. The beast is born from a 1,901 patent, a 19-ton iron and steel skeleton that would eventually change the face of global warfare. You stand beside Marianne, the first of her kind, and realize you are looking at the missing link of mechanical evolution. Before Alvin Lombard, traction was limited by the surface area of a wheel. If the mud was deep or the snow was soft, the machine simply dug its own grave. Lombard's genius was to make the machine carry its own road. You examine the continuous track, a loop of heavy steel lags connected by pins that distribute those 19 tons over a massive footprint. It is the first time a vehicle has been able to walk on top of the environment rather than fighting through it. Technical precision in 1901 was a matter of trial and error in a machine shop. When the first tracks hopped and slipped, Lombard added small steel cleats, teeth that bite into the ice like the spikes on a lumberjack's boots. This allowed the machine to achieve attractive effort that made horses look like toys. Benjamin Holt, the man who would found Caterpillar, saw this machine, recognized its brilliance, and bought the rights to the patent. The British military did the same, evolving this logging tool into the first tanks that would eventually crawl across the trenches of the Somme. You are touching the ancestor of every bulldozer and armored vehicle on the planet. But the how it works of the Lombard is where the engineering gets lethal. This is a direct drive system with no sophisticated transmission to buffer the power. Two massive horizontal cylinders are mounted to the frame, their pistons pumping with a violent, rhythmic thrum. These pistons turn a crankshaft, which drives a bevel gear differential. This differential is a masterpiece of open-air gearing. It allows the tracks to rotate at different speeds, so the 3-0-foot machine can actually turn. Precision engineering in this era meant pouring semi-steel gears that could withstand the shock of 300 tons of timber suddenly lurching forward on a frozen lake. The human grit required to build these machines was just as hard as the iron. You see the workers at the Waterville Iron Works, men who grew up in the deafening scream of sawmills, fitting these 19-ton puzzles together by hand. There were no assembly lines. Every bolt was tightened by a man who knew that a loose fitting in the deep bush meant a dead crew. In 1904, a single Lombard cost $5,000, a fortune that could buy a small town, and the companies expected it to run 24 hours a day until the spring thaw. The machine was the investment. The men were the operators tasked with making that investment bleed profit. You watch as the engineer blows down the cylinders, a jet of white steam hissing into the frozen air to clear out the condensation. If he doesn't, the water will hydrolock the engine, blowing the cylinder heads off with the force of a cannon. You realize that the machine is a living, breathing entity of high-pressure water and fire. It is temperamental, massive, and entirely indifferent to the survival of the 4 men on board. The tracks begin to move, the steel cleats crunching into the hand-iced road, and the 300-ton train begins to groan. The transition from the birth of the machine to the reality of its operation is a descent into a thermodynamic nightmare. To keep those tracks moving, you need steam, and to get steam, you need a fire that never sleeps. You move toward the rear of the machine, where the heat of the firebox meets the sub-zero wind, and you prepare to manage the delicate, explosive balance of a mobile boiler. The beast is hungry, and it is about to show you just how much it costs to keep it fed. Section 3. Thermodynamics of a mobile fire trap. The fireman's day begins at 2:00 inches the morning, while the rest of the logging camp is still lost in a heavy, dreamless sleep. You walk through the dark in -30-degree weather to the machine, your breath freezing instantly into a white mask. The Lombard needs 2 hours of constant stoking just to build a full head of steam from a cold start. You open the firebox, the orange glare hitting your face with a heat that feels like a physical blow. You lay the kindling, feed it birch and spruce, and then begin the grueling shift to coal. 1.5 tons of fuel will pass through your shovel before this single run is over. Thermodynamic precision in the middle of a frozen wilderness is a life-or-death calculation. You are managing a 19-ton pressure vessel running at 175 pounds per square inch. You watch the sight glass, a fragile tube of reinforced glass where the water level bounces rhythmically with the motion of the tracks. If the water drops too low, the crown sheet of the boiler will overheat and soften, leading to a detonation that will level the trees for 50 yards. If the water is too high, it enters the cylinders, and the incompressible liquid will blow the cylinder heads off like shrapnel. The margin between a working engine and a catastrophic explosion is exactly 2 inches of water in that glass. The how it works of the steam cycle is a relentless loop of energy conversion. The fire superheats the water becomes high-pressure steam, and that steam is piped into the twin cylinders. You feel the pistons push and pull through a bevel gear differential, translating the expansion of gas into the mechanical rotation of the sprockets. Every rotation of those sprockets moves the heavy steel track lags, which must bite into the ice to pull the 300-ton load forward. This is a chain of operation where every link is under immense stress. If any part of this thermodynamic cycle fails on a downgrade, the engine loses its ability to hold back the weight, and the machine becomes a 320-ton projectile. Human grit on the fire deck is defined by constant rhythmic motion. For 12 hours, you never stop shoveling. You don't stop to rest, and you don't stop to warm your hands. If the fire drops, the steam pressure drops. If the pressure drops, the engine slows. On a steep Canadian grade, a slowing engine is a death sentence because the 300 tons of timber behind you does not care about your pressure gauge. It keeps moving, driven by gravity and the relentless momentum of 8 loaded sleds. You are the heartbeat of the machine, and if your heart falters, the beast dies and takes you with it. Precision engineering in 1905 meant knowing the sound of the steam. You listen to the bark of the exhaust. A dry bark means the boiler is healthy. A wet, heavy cough means water is entering the cylinders. You adjust the dampers and the injectors by feel, your hands caked in coal dust and frozen sweat. One dry engineering joke among the Lombard crews was that the fireman was the only man in camp who could get a sunburn on his face while his backside was covered in frost. You realize that you are the guardian of a 1500-degree inferno, separated from the Arctic wind by only a few inches of riveted iron. The transition from the heat of the firebox to the frozen perch of the steersman is a move from the heart to the brain. You look forward past the boiler toward the man sitting in the open air at the very front of the machine. The steam you generate is the only thing he has to control the 320 tons of momentum currently screaming down the ice road. You prepare to watch the steersman take the wheel, where the heat of the stack and the ice of the forest meet in a lethal daily compromise. Section 4. The steersman's cage of fire and ice. The steersman's platform is an iron cage of contradictions, suspended at the very front of the 19-ton beast. You climb up to your perch at 4 a.m., leaving the radiating warmth of the boiler for a wooden bench that offers no protection from the elements. Behind you, the engineer's cab is a sheltered sanctuary, but you are 30 feet forward, sitting in the open air. The steering wheel is an 1/8-inch circle of cast iron, cold enough to burn through your leather gloves in seconds if you stop moving your hands. Above your head, the smokestack belches a constant stream of exhaust and incandescent embers. Technical precision at -30 degrees is a battle of sensory survival. You have no windshield and no walls. Many steersmen in the Canadian bush actively refused the optional wooden roofs because a roof slowed the jump. If the machine jackknifes or loses its footing on a curve. Your survival depends entirely on clearing that platform in a fraction of a second. A wall meant an extra half-second of entanglement. In that half-second, the 300-ton train hits the timber, and the iron wheel becomes a crushing weight. You sit exposed, your eyes watering from the freezing wind, ready to dive into the snow at the first sign of a snapping hitchpin. The how it works of the steering system is a brutal application of manual leverage. You are turning a heavy worm gear that pivots a massive set of iron-shod skis. There is no power steering. Every degree of turn is bought with the strain of your shoulders. But the most documented hazard isn't the cold, it's the fire. Because the smokestack is directly above you, the sparks from the wood-fired boiler land on your wool coat constantly. Your clothes catch fire regularly. This isn't a theory. It is a documented reality of the job. You don't stop to deal with a smoldering shoulder. You slap it out with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel, because stopping on a downgrade is not an option. Human grit on the suicide seat is measured in the frost burns on your face and the burn scars on your shoulders. You watch the iced ruts of the road, twin ribbons of glass prepared by the night crews who flooded the path until it froze smooth. If you steer even an inch out of those ruts, the 300 tons of momentum behind you will push the tractor's tail, initiating a jackknife that will fold the 8 sleds like a deck of cards. One dry engineering joke among the old Lombard crews was that a steersman's primary qualification was having arms like a blacksmith and a nervous system like a dead man. You notice the bell rope running the 400-foot length of the train to the conductor at the rear. One ring means stop. This is the machine's entire nervous system, a piece of hemp rope and a single brass bell. It is only as good as the weakest oak pole connecting the sleds. If a pole snaps on a sharp curve, the sleds behind the brake are suddenly free, disconnected from the engine's holding power, and running on pure gravity. The conductor must recognize the brake instantly and jump, because those 300 tons of logs don't know he's there, and they don't care. The transition from the steersman's frozen vigil to the company's legal ledger is a move from the physical to the systemic. You look at the scarred hands of the men around you, realizing that the beast is not just consuming wood and coal, it is consuming the people who operate it. You prepare to examine the arithmetic of the logging camps, where the value of the machine was measured in gold, and the value of the man was measured in a few lines of fine print. Section 5. The arithmetic of blood and ledgers. The arithmetic of the logging camps was as cold and unyielding as the permafrost. You examine the company ledger and see the stark reality of 1,905. A single Lombard Steam Hauler cost $8,000, roughly $200,000 in today's currency. It was a massive capital investment that the company protected with religious fervor. Against that, a steersman was paid double or triple the wages of a regular logger, but he was legally worth almost nothing. You are operating in an era governed by assumption of risk, a brutal legal doctrine that stated simply, if you took a dangerous job, you accepted every consequence of that danger. The company's liability for your life was exactly zero. Technical precision in the legal fine print meant that the machine was the asset and the man was the consumable. If a hitch pole snapped and the 300-ton train crushed the steersman, the law provided 3 impenetrable defenses for the employer: contributory negligence, the fellow-servant rule, and the most lethal of all, the assumption of risk. You realize that suing the company was a fool's errand. In a remote Canadian logging camp, with no witnesses except your own crew who needed their jobs to eat, the company's lawyers could prove you were at fault before the snow even melted off your boots. The how it works of the corporate machinery was just as efficient as the Lombard's gears. When a man died, his name was struck from the roll. His remaining wages after deducting room, board, and the cost of his equipment were bundled and sent to his family, and his bunk was given to the next man in line. There was no workers' compensation, no insurance, and no safety net. You see the silence of the towns these men left behind, where wives remarried not for love, but because the mathematics of survival in a northern winter required a man's wages. One specific archive-based fact from the 1910 period notes that the first compensation laws didn't arrive until after the steam era had already claimed its heavy toll. Human grit in this systemic trap was a form of professional defiance. Why did you climb back onto that platform every morning? It wasn't just the money. It was the particular pride of being the only man in 3 counties who could keep 175 pounds of steam alive in a blizzard. You were the stay with her man, a category created by the workers themselves for those who steered through the crash instead of jumping. It was a badge of honor forged in the grease and the ice. You realize that for these men, the alternative was a life that felt smaller than the one they were living. They calculated the risk, found it acceptable, and gripped the wheel. Precision engineering in the bush meant repairing the machine with whatever you had on hand. You look at the boiler housing of a working Lombard and see the dents and weld scars from previous jackknives and impacts. These machines were built knowing they would be crashed. The ironwork around the critical components was armor, designed to save the engine even if it didn't save the operator. You see a blacksmith's hammer resting on the saddle tank, a reminder that in this world, if you couldn't fix it with heat and force, it didn't belong in the woods. The transition from the systemic cold of the ledger to the quiet of the mechanical graveyard is the final move of the story. You look at the cooling iron of the tracks as the shift ends, realizing that the beast has finally run out of forest to conquer. The era of steam is ending, but the technology it birthed is about to go to war. You prepare to see where the Lombard went to die and what it left behind in the mud and the memories of the Great White North. Section 6. Ghosts in the Great White North. The transition from the violent, high-pressure roar of the Hall to the rusted silence of the river landing marks the end of an era. You watch as the pin knockers move between the 8 sleds, pulling the heavy steel hitch pins that have held 300 tons of timber in a single, lethal line. The Lombard, freed of its burden, seems to breathe a sigh of relief, its safety valves fluttering with a gentle hiss of escaping steam. By 1928, the steam-powered beast had run out of world to conquer. It was replaced not by a better log hauler, but by the bulldozer, a machine that could build year-round roads for trucks, rendering the specialized ice road physics of the Lombard obsolete. Technical precision in the 1930s meant moving toward the internal combustion engine. Gasoline and diesel were simpler. They didn't require a fireman to risk his life over a 175 psi pressure vessel in the dark. You see the final Lombard, a diesel machine built in 1934, the same year the company closed its doors for good. Alvin Lombard died in 1937 at the age of 81, having watched the industry he helped build move past the very tool he invented. Most of the 83 steam machines ended as scrap, or were simply abandoned beside logging roads in Ontario and Quebec, left to be reclaimed by the forest they once devoured. The human grit of the Lombard crews is an invisible monument built into the frames of the houses in Montreal, Toronto, and Boston. You realize that the impossible engineering of the log hauler was the labor that emancipated the horses, only to chain the men to a different kind of killing work. One specific archive-based fact from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers notes that in 1982, the Lombard was designated a National Historic Landmark. The plaque accurately states that it emancipated the horses. It doesn't mention the steersmen with the burn scars on their shoulders or the fingers lost to the iron wheel. As the fire in the box finally dies and the last of the steam dissipates into the crisp morning air, you feel a deep, reverent stillness. The era of the steam hauler was a brief, bloody chapter where our mechanical ambition outpaced our safety factors, but the legacy is immovable. The concept of the continuous track, proven in the freezing mud of the North, became the blueprint for the tanks of World War I and the machinery that builds our world today. We are left with the answer to our final question. Why did they climb back up? Because they were the men who could. They found a particular terrifying satisfaction in a run completed, a load delivered, and a machine still running at the end of it. They made a daily peace with risk because the alternative was a life that lacked the weight of responsibility and the thrill of the heavy haul. They don't make them like that anymore. Not the machines and not the men.